The capital had been under siege for almost 2 years. Thousands had died in the city, killed by sniper and shell attacks. But this was a dark day, even by the standards of the Bosnian War. Shortly after 12 p.m., a mortar round hit the city center. It shattered a busy marketplace. 68 civilians were killed. Over 100 more were wounded. The images of death and destruction were beamed around the world. It was a new low in a horrifying and often baffling war. Western powers were divided over how or whether to intervene.
There was a sense throughout the Bosnia War that nobody wanted to get too heavily involved because it was a civil war.
It was the first, if you like, ethical test for what the Western alliance would do now that the Cold War was over.
The war had already ripped apart a nation. It would go on to threaten the credibility of NATO and the UN. It would force foreign powers into secret and unsavory alliances.
The policy didn't work because this assumption that there were two sides that were evenly matched fighting each other was incorrect to begin with.
And it would lead to the worst act of genocide in Europe since the Holocaust.
In the Balkans during World War II, resistance against Nazi occupation had been led by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia.
After victory in Europe, they set about building a new communist state. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was made up of 6 countries: Slovenia, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia, home to the capital, Belgrade. The Serbs were the biggest ethnic group, but this was a multinational federation bound together by the autocratic rule of one man. Tito spent his life defying the odds. He was a revolutionary communist who defied Stalin and survived.
But perhaps the most unlikely and remarkable of his achievements was holding together the diverse people of Yugoslavia and their varying faiths for 35 years.
The point about Yugoslavia is that Yugoslavia had succeeded against all the odds in reconciling most of these nationalities roughly into a state.
The other types of divisions in the society, let's say class divisions, these things had been sort of wiped out by the communist rules. So there weren't other identity categories that could compete with ethnicity.
When Tito died, it fell apart, and that natural quilt, that patchwork quilt of nationalities, became a source of great instability.
Nationalism grew in the republics. Cracks formed between those in favor of a strong centralized state and those seeking more independence from Belgrade. It was a divide that was impossible to bridge. The collapse of communism was sudden. In country after country, regime after regime, the Iron Curtain came down with stunning speed. In Yugoslavia, too, the old ways were coming to an end. The federation splintered along national and ethnic lines. In 1991, Croatia and Slovenia were the first to push for independence. Armed conflict broke out as the Serb-dominated Yugoslav army tried and failed to stop them. War would soon come to Bosnia as well. Bosnia and Herzegovina was the most diverse of the Yugoslav republics. Muslims, Croats, and Serbs lived side by side throughout the country.
Bosnia was a multinational republic in which no one ethno-national group comprised the majority of the population.
The relations had been fairly good, and Muslims and Serbs and Croats lived in close proximity, went to the same schools, and interacted with each other on a daily basis.
The largest group were the Bosnian Muslims, who comprised about 43% of the population. And they were really quite happy with being in Yugoslavia. They were perhaps the most keen of all Yugoslavs, and they didn't want to be independent.
The Bosnian Serbs also wanted to resist any move towards independence. Their leader was Radovan Karadzic. Karadzic was a former psychiatrist and a convicted fraudster. He threatened bloodshed should the country try to leave Yugoslavia. But he was outmaneuvered. At the beginning of 1992, the Bosnian parliament voted for a referendum on independence. It was boycotted by the Bosnian Serbs. But the Croats and the Muslim Bosniaks overwhelmingly backed the split with Yugoslavia.
Each sort of ethnic community was at that point represented by the nationalists, and made it very difficult for these different parties to find a common point that they could agree on. Once Croatia decided to leave, I think there was a lot of appetite within the Croat community in Bosnia for independence. And since the nationalists were in power for the Muslim community, the Bosniaks as well, they allied basically with the Croats and opted for independence.
On the 3rd of March 1992, the Bosnian parliament in Sarajevo formally declared the country's independence. But Radovan Karadzic would keep his promise of violence. A plan was already in place for a war that would rip the new country apart. It was a plan directed from Belgrade by Karadzic's key ally. Slobodan Milosevic posed as a strongman. The president of the Serbian Republic, he had seized power on a wave of nationalism. Now he sought to carve out a greater Serbia from the remains of Yugoslavia.
The Serbs as a group, they comprised less than half of the population of Yugoslavia, but nevertheless they had a majority in the officer corps in the Yugoslav army for various historical reasons. 3 out of the 4 top commanders of the Yugoslav army were Serbs. And it was possible for Milosevic to coerce the army, to co-opt it, to get it to fight essentially as Serbia's army against the other republics.
And the reason for that was that when the Yugoslav army pulled its forces from Croatia through Bosnia, they basically left all the heavy weaponry and the equipment with the Bosnian Serb forces.
With Serbian soldiers co-opted in the new Bosnian Serb military, Radovan Karadzic had the muscle to back up his threats. A month after the new nation declared its independence, the Bosnian Serbs went to war.
The Bosnian government, as I mentioned before, wasn't really very well prepared for this war. It hadn't really expected the war to break out, so although it had made some preparations to organize defense forces, they were not very well advanced, whereas the sort of Serb forces were very well prepared.
The Bosnian Serbs surrounded the new Bosnian capital of Sarajevo and bombarded the city from the hills. They shut down the water and electricity cut off roads, and blocked all supplies of food and medicine.
The strategy was to essentially to besiege it, with the aim of kind of starving and terrorizing the population and the government into submission. So it kind of adopted this plan to attack the Bosnian government in its own capital city by using the territories around it, some of which were largely inhabited by Serbs.
500,000 people were now under siege in Sarajevo. And the violence elsewhere in the country was growing day after day. The question being asked in Bosnia, and far beyond, was what would the rest of the world do about it? Bosnia's bid for independence from the collapsing Yugoslavia had sparked bloody civil war. The powerful Bosnian Serb army of Radovan Karadzic had the capital, Sarajevo, surrounded and under siege. They had seized territory across the country and begun a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing of the large Muslim community. Once integrated communities would be torn apart. Hundreds of mosques and churches would be destroyed. And millions made refugees for the crime of being the wrong race, the wrong religion. These were brutal scenes Europe did not imagine would happen so soon after the Holocaust.
There were two reasons for the ethnic cleansing campaign in Bosnia. And one was strategic military, the other one was political. On the strategic side, at the beginning of the war, there was this serious asymmetry between the Bosnian Serb forces and the Croat and Bosnian Muslim forces. And the worry on the part of the Bosnian Serb leadership was that if they waited too long, they might lose this military upper hand. And the political reason was that each sort of ethnic community was at that point represented by the nationalists. What that did was that it made it very difficult to negotiate before the war started.
In the early days of the war, the Catholic Croats and Muslim Bosniaks were allies against the Bosnian Serbs. In late 1992, however, that alliance fractured. They began fighting each other instead. A full-blown war within a war broke out. The Bosnian Serbs could watch as their enemies exhausted themselves. Then, they hoped, they would destroy them both and reign supreme. At the beginning of the war, the United Nations already had troops in the region. Its multinational protection force was deployed in Croatia, trying to keep the peace in the newly independent state. In June 1992, its mandate was extended to Bosnia and Herzegovina, with the Bosnian Serbs surrounding Sarajevo. The airport was the capital's last link with the outside world. The runway had to stay open. UN crews braved mortar shells and small arms fire, but they kept flying day after day. Over the course of the war, they would deliver almost 160,000 tons of humanitarian aid to the besieged city. What they did not give the Bosniaks were the weapons they needed to fight back. An arms embargo was in place on all of the former Yugoslavia.
The embargo had been established by United Nations Security Council Resolution 713 in 1991. And at the time, the idea was to prevent the transfer of weapons to a region that might see conflict.
The initial reason was thinking that if we don't provide weapons, then the war will end quicker. After the summer of 1992, however, it should have been clear that there was very serious asymmetry between the different forces, and the embargo was basically exacerbating that and allowing the Serbs to take over territory and carry out an ethnic cleansing campaign.
The Bosnian army grew out from what was left of the Territorial Defense Force and from the ruling party's militia. But these were unarmed, they didn't have the weapons that the Yugoslav army had.
Bosnia itself was not the only battleground in this war. All the combatants lobbied foreign powers. The future of the arms embargo and the war itself would depend in part on whose story would be most believed. Lobbyists for the Serbian government targeted London. The Serbs would find many friends in the corridors of power, where memories of their partisans' fight against the Nazis lingered. The British government of the day, under Prime Minister John Major, backed the arms embargo on the former Yugoslavia.
It's a question of what is useful, what is actually going to save lives, what is going to restore the situation.
Douglas Hurd, the British Foreign Secretary during the war, had been the champion in the West of this appeasement of Serbia, so a real opponent of any action against Serbia. During the war, an opponent of lifting the arms embargo, an opponent of airstrikes against Serbia.
Britain had started off by operating with the United Nations simply to deliver food, and Britain was trying to guard the convoys, the UN convoys that were delivering food into Bosnia.
The preference in much of Whitehall was for a diplomatic solution to the war. London believed Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic was their best hope to end the conflict.
Yugoslavia had enjoyed quite cordial relations with Britain up until the breakup, and Milosevic was very good at selling himself as his Serbia was a continuation of Yugoslavia. So there was a kind of instinctive tendency then for Britain to transfer its friendship from Yugoslavia to Serbia. And he actually was the one who was at the center of this web, was kind of the godfather who had to control everything and bring it together.
Milosevic was a former banker. He had worked in New York, Paris, and London. He was charming and spoke fluent English. He was a man Britain thought it could do business with. While Milosevic had friends in London, elsewhere, the Muslim Bosniaks and Croats found sympathizers of their own. In Washington, congressional opposition to the arms embargo was growing, as was the pressure on the US President Bill Clinton. His predecessor, George Bush, had thought the conflict a European problem, for the Europeans to resolve. Clinton took a different approach. On the campaign trail, he had taken up a policy pushed by senior Democratic senators. It was called Lift and Strike. Lift the UN arms embargo to provide the Bosniaks with the weapons they needed, and strike Bosnian Serb military targets to push them back. After his election victory, Clinton made it the policy of his new administration. He dispatched his Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, to drum up support abroad. In May 1993, Secretary Christopher lobbied America's allies. He visited London and Paris, Berlin, Rome, and Moscow. They all said no to supporting Clinton's strategy against the Bosnian Serbs.
The Europeans were opposed simply because several European countries had troops on the ground in the UN mission for Bosnia, UNPROFOR. And so they were afraid that if the United States or NATO conducted airstrikes, either their troops could be targeted or they could be taken hostages by the Serbs as a retaliation against the airstrikes.
And then I think there is a more sort of ideological type of explanation for it, which is that there is this sort of impression of the Balkans in general and Yugoslavia in particular as a place where these types of things tend to happen.
There was a sense in which they were viewed in racist terms as warring tribes with ancient ethnic hatreds. They were just as bad as each other.
This, to a large extent, contributed to the slow reaction by the Clinton administration to the escalating violence in Bosnia. The Clinton administration, to be fair, also tried to convince European allies to do more, but eventually ended up putting a premium on cohesion within NATO and cohesion within the European allies.
Officially, Clinton dropped his support for lift and strike. Continuing the arms embargo became American policy instead. But behind the scenes, the US government was more divided.
The first element was certainly a rivalry within the administration. There were some more aggressive and hawkish elements like Vice President Gore and United Nations Ambassador Madeleine Albright, and some more dovish actors like the military and the Pentagon, who were very much unwilling to commit US troops. The second element was clearly a preoccupation by the Clinton administration with domestic politics.
Clinton was looking very bad in the eyes of his own public, like a weak leader. They had no interest in fighting Serbia, in losing their soldiers' lives in a conflict with Serbia.
The Clinton administration understood that American public opinion was not in favor of an extensive US intervention in Bosnia.
The Central Intelligence Agency also backed the arms embargo. They believed supplying weapons to the Bosniaks or Croats would make little difference on the battlefield against the Bosnian Serbs. Other branches of the US government disagreed. Among them was the Pentagon. A covert operation began to arm the Bosniaks. It was an operation which would be officially denied, which would lead the United States to break ranks with its closest allies. The war was growing bloodier. Over 2/3 of the country was now occupied by the Bosnian Serb army. Before the war, more than 1.7 million Muslim Bosniaks and Catholic Croats had lived in those areas. The vast majority were now being forced from their homes by threats, by violence, by systematic rape, and murder. Those who did not flee were taken to concentration camps and detention centers. Thousands died. The international community was unable to contain the violence. Plans to end the conflict were suggested, but none made headway. UN peacekeepers were on the ground, but there was no peace for them to keep. Lives were being lost, families scattered, homes and communities destroyed. Many in the Muslim world felt compelled to act. Soon, Muslim volunteers were making their way to the war-torn country from across North Africa and the Middle East. It was just a few dozen at first, but the numbers grew. By 1993, there were several hundred foreign Mujahideen fighters in Bosnia.
So they weren't helpful. In military terms, 2,000 or 3,000 people in a Bosnian army of perhaps 200,000 were not much use, really. They didn't really help. They actually made it worse. They carried out atrocities, particularly against Croat civilians, also against Serb civilians, which just discredited the Bosnian cause.
At Travnik, 50 miles west of Sarajevo, the Mujahideen drove the non-Muslim population from the town. They then tried to enforce Sharia law on those who remained. The form of Islam practiced traditionally in Bosnia had been more moderate and tolerant. There was limited appetite for the more extreme interpretations of the newcomers. This extremism was playing into the hands of the Bosnian Serbs.
So the presence of Mujahideen in the Bosnian War was a golden propaganda gift to the Serb nationalists and the Croat nationalists because it allowed them to portray the Bosnian army, which was really a secular army, to portray it as kind of a fundamentalist jihadi army, which was anti-Christian and which was carrying out atrocities.
Some in the Bosnian government were uneasy about the extremists fighting beside them. But they had little choice. They needed all the help they could get. The UN arms embargo was crippling Bosnia's defense forces. They had only light arms to defend Sarajevo. The Serbs had tanks and heavy artillery. If Bosnia was to survive the war, the embargo had to end or be broken. A secret weapons conduit was developed to try to bolster the Bosnian government. Donations from the Middle East were used to buy weapons from Hungary, Argentina, the former USSR, and Pakistan. They were shipped at night through Turkey and Croatia, initially on Iranian aircraft. The United States knew about the shipments. But did it do more than look the other way?
Clinton eventually, in the face of this embarrassing failure of Western policy, took certain measures to strengthen the Bosnian defenses, to sort of stop fighting between the Bosnian army and the Croats, so that they would unite against the Serbs, to allow the Iranians to send arms to the Bosnian army. A whole number of measures which shifted the balance of forces against the Serb rebels to push them into peace.
Early in 1995, troops from the UN Nordic Battalion were stationed near the North Bosnian city of Tuzla. That February, the soldiers saw Hercules aircraft landing in the city at night. Soon, anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and advanced communications equipment appeared in the hands of Bosniak forces on the front line. Though the UN troops at Tuzla reported what they had seen, an alleged breach of the arms embargo by forces unknown, the investigation was a whitewash. NATO denied there were any breaches of the no-fly zone. There were no airdrops. There were no weapons. But it was US Navy surveillance planes in the skies over Bosnia that February. And the investigation was conducted by American personnel. If the Pentagon was behind arms shipments to Bosnia, they had no intention of it being exposed by an investigation they themselves would carry out. NATO's role in Bosnia and Herzegovina had been steadily growing since the start of the conflict. The no-fly zone established in October 1992 was a mostly symbolic move. The Bosnian Serbs had already seized most of the country, and it was their artillery, not their aircraft, that was doing the real damage. In February 1994, the marketplace in Sarajevo was hit. The mortar round had been fired from Bosnian Serb territory. It killed 68 civilians and demanded a response. It was agreed
that now at least NATO would provide close air support to UN forces on the ground to protect them from Bosnian Serb forces. But any requests for airstrikes still had to be approved by civilian authorities at the UN. The cumbersome process threatened to waste NATO's air superiority and massive firepower. Yet again, the response of the international community to the crisis was muddled and piecemeal.
The United States from the start tried to push for airstrikes against the Serbs, whereas European allies like France and the UK and others who had forces on the ground in the US, in the UN mission UNPROFOR, were against those airstrikes because it could put their personnel at risk.
Yet again, in the midst of the confusion and vacillation, the people of Bosnia were the ones to suffer. The cost of that international indecision was about to become horrifyingly clear. "1994 was the year the Bosnian War turned. The flow of contraband arms into the country had strengthened the Bosnian army. It still lacked heavy weaponry, but now had more than 100,000 troops at its command. In February, the war within a war between the Muslim Bosniaks and the Catholic Croats ended. Peace talks had been brokered by the Americans, and a deal signed in Washington. The alliance renewed. The Bosniaks and Croats turned their combined strength on the Bosnian Serbs. The Bosnian Serbs, meanwhile, were fighting among themselves. Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic fell out with the Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic. He, in turn, fell out with the commander of his armies, the brutal and ruthless General Ratko Mladic, blaming him for losses on the battlefield. The Bosnian Serbs were isolated and divided. As 1995 began, their military tactics became increasingly desperate. After NATO airstrikes destroyed an ammunition depot, Bosnian Serbs seized 400 UN troops and held them hostage as human shields. Worse was to come. The town of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia and Herzegovina had been besieged by the Bosnian Serbs since the beginning of the war in 1992.
This was supposed to be a UN-safe area. In fact, this is where a lot of the Muslims from eastern Bosnia had escaped when the Serbs took over.
Srebrenica was meant to be one of the protected areas. There were a series of areas like Bihać, Srebrenica was another one, where international troops were saying, look, civilians here will be safe. But for strategic reasons, the Serbs wanted to take over Srebrenica. How could they take it over if there were 8,000 men of fighting age with weapons there? Well, the only way they could take it over was to march the men away and kill them.
In July 1995, the Bosnian Serbs launched an attack on the demilitarized enclave. They believed the Dutch UN peacekeepers would do nothing to stop them. They were right. UN forces abandoned their positions, falling back or surrendering as the Serbs advanced. There was no response from the international community. Emboldened, Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic ordered his troops to push on and capture the town.
We have to also realize that UN safe area didn't mean there was a very significant UN military presence there, and the units there didn't really have the mandate to get involved because they didn't have the permission to do so.
The truth was that the number of Dutch forces that were available in Srebrenica, even if they'd chosen to fight against the Serbs, they would not have succeeded. They would probably have got themselves killed. But there was a sense that, look, they were soldiers. They should have been prepared to deter.
the Serbs separated the men from the women. The women were permitted safe passage to Bosniak-held territory. The men were systematically executed.
That men were lined up in groups of 10 and 15 and just shot in the back of the head and thrown into ditches. Within a week, there were photographs of that. And within 2 or 3 weeks, it was absolutely clear what had happened. And there was a sense of shock.
The size of the massacre at Srebrenica, which was something unprecedented in the Bosnian conflict, and still remains one of the largest genocides or genocidal events in Europe since the Second World War.
The Serbs tried to say, first of all, that it hadn't happened, then that it was all a rogue unit who were not acting under orders. Nobody ever believed that. This was a battlefield decision which was made at the time.
Within days, world leaders gathered in London. All were now agreed that something had to change.
Srebrenica was also important because it happened after the Rwandan genocide, and this was another case in which the international community basically didn't do anything and let the genocide take place.
Srebrenica was a microcosm of the problem, that if you're going to stop some of these dreadful massacres, you've got to be prepared to fight, and you've got to have enough troops to be able to do it.
The London Conference of July 1995 agreed that any further acts of Serb aggression would be met with massive NATO airstrikes. Just weeks later, that act of aggression came. On the 28th of August 1995, there was another attack on the marketplace in Sarajevo. 37 civilians were killed and 90 wounded. 2 days later, NATO launched Operation Deliberate Force.
The marketplace bombing basically once again showed that the Bosnian Serb forces would continue engaging in these types of massacres.
They were final straws, and they convinced the world that we will have a peace settlement, we will impose it. Until then, people had said, well, peacekeepers are there to hold the ring. They're not there to fight. They're there to observe, to try to protect people who need protecting. But after this, the idea was muscular peacekeeping. If we need to fight, we will do so. If we need to actually break into the Serbian positions, we will. And that sense that, okay, we'll take the gloves off because we're doing it for humanitarian purposes.
Just 22 days after the airstrikes began, the operation was ended. The Bosnian Serbs had withdrawn their heavy weapons from around Sarajevo. Peace talks began, and a ceasefire was declared.
And I remember speaking to a number of British commanders afterwards, talking to them about their soldiering, and they said, I'm really proud that we saved lives. We took some lives, but by taking some lives and by threatening and by fighting, I know that I saved a lot of lives, and I'm very proud of that.
That November, at Dayton, Ohio, a final peace agreement was brokered by U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Richard Holbrooke between the Bosnians, Croats, and Serbs. After more than 3.5 years of bloodshed, the war in Bosnia was at an end.
So the Dayton Agreement, which was reached in November 1995, ended the war, and it was a peace agreement that didn't really give any side a clear or outright victory.
The United States took the lead in saying this will be what the structure of nationalities in the Balkans will look like for the foreseeable future, and we will enforce it with NATO forces. And from then on, there has been a reasonable stability that's lasted from 1995 to the present. There have been some changes in the Balkans, but nothing that would fundamentally destabilize the region.
It was probably most favorable to the Serb nationalist side. They achieved most from it, in the sense that you had the recognition of the Republika Srpska, the entity established by the Serb rebels. This was given legitimacy as an entity within a state.
But the peace agreement couldn't disguise the fact that the United Nations and NATO had failed in Bosnia. They failed to prevent the aggression of the Bosnian Serbs. They failed to protect the people.
Should the West and NATO have acted earlier than they did and perhaps prevented such a large massacre like the one in Srebrenica? Probably yes. However, there were some clear concerns and clear divisions both within the United Nations and within the European allies and the United States that prevented a more cohesive strategy from the start.
Somehow it seemed illegitimate to impose a solution on peoples who didn't seem to want it.
So it was really a question of whether the Western alliance, really, and the international community beyond that, had an interest or was prepared to intervene in an area like that for essentially ethical reasons, to uphold certain principles that, you can't massacre civilian populations, you can't carry out genocide.
And that's one of the hard lessons of the 1990s, that sometimes not doing something is as bad as doing the wrong thing.
Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, and others responsible for genocide and war crimes would eventually face justice at The Hague. But there are wounds that guilty verdicts and life sentences cannot mend. 100,000 people died in the conflict. Millions became refugees. Decades on from the end of the war, Bosnia is still healing.
So when I was interviewing people, and this was primarily in Prijedor in northwest Bosnia, where the initial concentration camps were formed, the one thing that I thought was very interesting when I did my interviews, it was this emotion of surprise, right? Not anger, not yes, we knew this was what was going to happen. But the reaction overwhelmingly was how surprised they were. And it's in a way a comforting thought, because you think, well, these things happen over there, but not here. This was not something that they expected until it started happening.
If you say to anyone, Srebrenica, it's a place in the Balkans, no, it's not. It's a massacre.
Srebrenica casts a shadow far beyond Bosnia. It is a shameful reminder that failure to act can have a terrible cost. After the Holocaust, the world said, never again. After Srebrenica, it was forced to ask, where next? And what will we do then?